Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to take this off for a bit so you can hear me better. My name is Robert Mace, and I work at the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment. I'm a groundwater hydrologist. We generally prefer to be called hydrogeologists. Don't dare call us geologists. And I'm going to talk to you all a little bit later about sustainability, but Bill Bunch asked me to bring in this little instrument that I have that's called a theremin. And I've been messing around with theremins for, and I was just counting it up before I came on stage, 25 years. I saw a documentary back in the mid-90s at the Dolby Theater about Dr. Leon Theremin, who had invented this instrument. And it's a very, very unique instrument. And I'm sure some of you probably heard about it. You know, back in the 90s and even 2000s, not many people heard of the theremin. But it's become kind of a hipper thing to work into music. What's unique about it is you play it without touching it. You don't have to touch it to play it. Now, obviously, I had to touch it to set things up, but you wave your hands around it. Now, my specialty in science is groundwater modeling, and there's a joke that there's a lot of arm waving in groundwater modeling, and so this is a perfect instrument for a groundwater modeler to play because there's a lot of arm waving in playing the theremin. Now what it does is it creates an electromagnetic field around these antennas. So there's a loop here, and then there's this vertical antenna here. The loop is playing the volume, and the reason I have my hand down here is if I let up on it, it'll start making some sounds. And then this is pitch, and depending on how close or far away your hand is or anything conductive, it'll make sounds. And so another neat little tidbit about this is 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the creation of this device by Leon Theremin. The first virtuoso on the theremin was a lady by the name of Clara Rockmore. And I don't know if the camera can zoom or not, but I've actually got a little homage to Clara here on the front of this theremin. This theremin is made by Bob Moog of Moog Synthesizers. So if you're in the instruments and synthesizers, you would know about Moog. He started off actually making theremins and then moved into kind of analog synthesizers, so synthesizers with all the knobs on it. And then later in his life, he went back to making theremin kits. And so this is a theremin kit that I stuck in a box made by some dude out of Wimberley. So it makes it a little unique. So I'm going to go ahead and play something. Now, I have a confession to make. I'm not a virtuoso on this thing. I pretty much just wave my arms around it because I'm a groundwater modeler and I'm good at it. But you're going to see me doing a bunch of waving with my hands around. It can get, at least in my perception, get a little dull. At least my wife tells me. It's like, man, you've been playing that damn thing for 30 minutes now. Stop. And so I've got it run through a loop pedal down here. And so it allows me to kind of interact with myself. And it has a little bit of a drum machine in it. So the drum machine is not coming out of here, and then you're going to hear multiple layers. But watch my hand real closely when I'm playing it, and you'll see what I'm doing and what I'm adding when I play this song. And I'm just ad-libbing this, so I'm not sure what to call it. Maybe the March of the Barton Spring Salamander seems like a good name. I was thinking like somebody peed in the pool, but maybe that's not a good thing to name it. And I'm going to put my mask back on because I think it's kind of cool to wear a mask when you're playing instruments. So let me get my mask back on and we'll get started. Got to make an adjustment there. you have it, the theremin on its 100th anniversary. March of the Barton Springs Salamander. It actually came out okay.
Bravo, bravo. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about sustainability. And I want to talk about sustainability in Barton Springs in the world, and kind of want to keep it pretty conceptual. And actually, the theremin kind of serves as a good symbol for sustainability. And we'll talk about what sustainability is in a bit, but sustainability involves a lot of information, understanding, and science. But then there's also a people component to it as well. And although the science is critically important, the people component is just as important, if not more important, because if the people don't have a will to manage resources, or for example, manage the Edwards Aquifer sustainably, then we don't have the springs that we love and enjoy today. And so the theremin, there's a bunch of science wrapped up in this thing, but it takes a person to interact with that science to achieve the goal, which in this case was a song about Barton Springs salamanders. So first, let's talk about concept of sustainability. And imagine a piggy bank, and you've got the bank itself, which is, has a reserve of coins in it, money in it. You've got the little slot on top of the piggy bank that you add your coins to it. And then we're going to assume this piggy bank has a hole in the bottom that you can pull the coins out. You don't have to smash it. And so you may be pulling some money out of that piggy bank to buy something, sodas or whatever, food. And so the bank itself, let's say it has $100 of value inside of it. And then you're putting in $5 per month. Maybe that's your allowance. That was my allowance when I was growing up, but that was a long time ago. $5 doesn't get you much these days. But we're putting $5 a month into this piggy bank. That is $100 in it. And then out the bottom is the money that I'm taking out to do whatever. So if we got $5 a month coming in the top, and we're pulling out $4 a month for expenses, what does that mean for the amount of money that's in the bank? And it's going to go up, right? And sorry about math so early in the morning, but you've got more coming in that's coming out, and so you're going to maintain that $100 and actually increase it over time. Now let's say you're putting $5 in a month, but now you're pulling $5 out a month. And you wind up, in that case, at the end of the month with $100. You've maintained kind of that corpus of funding in the bank. And if you keep that up indefinitely, then you're sustaining that amount of money in the bank, the piggy bank. But if you have $5 a month going in, but instead you're pulling $6 a month out the bottom, what does that do to the corpus, the money in the bank? It's decreasing slowly over time. Now, we could be pulling out $10 a month, in which case it's going to decrease much more quickly over time. And so that's kind of the concept of sustainability is related to that kind of corpus of funds, or that collection of coins that's in the piggy bank. And you can think of, if you're spending more than what you're earning, that's unsustainable. You're going to it's going to cause problems, probably going to deplete your account. So sustainability, kind of a general definition, is the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level. And so if there's $5 coming in, $5 coming out, we've achieved sustainability. If there's $5 coming in, $4 coming out, we're still sustaining that corpus, and in fact even growing it. $5 coming in, $6 coming out, we're no longer being sustainable. Aquifers work very much the same way. And in the Edwards Aquifer in particular that feeds Barton Springs also works the same way. So now imagine a bathtub. I like to imagine one of those kind of old school cloth-footed bathtubs. And we've got the plug in it, and so it's filled with water. And we've got the shower head on that is showering water into the tub. And so you can think of the tub itself as the aquifer. That's where the water is stored. Now, of course, real aquifers aren't this giant void, although there certainly are caves and voids in the Edwards Aquifer. It's made up of limestone. Other aquifers are made up of sandstones and gravels, but the Edwards is made up of limestone. And the tub basically is the stored water in the aquifer, and there can actually be quite a bit of water stored in an aquifer. Now, every tub has, or at least it should have, an overflow drain. And so that's kind of the tick-tock safety measure, I guess. You know, if you draw a tub or draw a bath, fill the tub up for a bath, and then you're off somewhere else and you get wrapped up on your phone or with a show and you forget you've turned on the water, you've got this overflow that keeps the tub from overflowing and wrecking your house. And so you can think of that overflow as spring flow. And indeed, that's kind of how Barton Springs, actually it is how Barton Springs acts with respect to the Edwards Aquifer. That the aquifer is full, the water levels are high, and it allows flow to go to the springs. Or in the case of this tub, we've got water coming in as replenishment to our little aquifer, and it's feeding those springs. Now, where the human component comes in is the drain. Now, most tubs kind of have those little push things these days, or a rubber plug if you had a clawfoot tub. But we've got a fancy, for this thought experiment, we've got a fancy plug in the tub where we have a dial on it that we can dial how much goes out or down the drain, control how fast the tub drains. And we're going to use that in this thought experiment as a proxy for pumping. So as people came along and technology developed, as a society, we developed the ability to drill wells and produce water from those wells. Now, sometimes in the Edwards Aquifer, you can actually drill a well and the water will flow out on its own due to the pressure in the aquifer. But most cases, you require a pump in that well. And so now we've got a new sink on the system of water going out the drain or towards these wells. And what happens in our thought experiment if the amount of water going out the drain, out to the wells, equals the amount of water coming in? This is a little different than the piggy bank experiment, but what winds up happening is the aquifer comes to a new equilibrium and no water flows out of the tub anymore, and no water flows out of the springs. Now, in reality, things are more complicated because the shower head of recharge for the Edwards Aquifer in the Barton Springs is not a constant flow, so we get more flow in parts of the year, more recharge, more rainfall in parts of the year than other parts of the year. But if pumping equaled that recharge, we would see Barton Springs go dry for periods of time. And so people are controlling through policy, through public involvement, that dial on that plug in the tub, essentially the amount of pumping that's occurring in that aquifer. And so the Edwards Aquifer that feeds Barton Springs acts the same way. The recharge is coming from rainfall that falls on the outcrop of the Edwards Aquifer, so basically where you can go out and actually stand on the Edwards rocks and water infiltrates in. One thing that's a little unique about the Edwards Aquifer is the streams lose a lot of water. Water flows across those streams and sinks into the aquifer. In fact, if you go out and Google, you can find whirlpools where whirlpools will form in some of these creeks as that water's drained into the aquifer. And so there's a catchment zone that goes up into the hill country that also impacts how much water is recharging the Edwards Aquifer, as well as the quality of the water that's recharging. And then the tub is the limestone that water is flowing to, and then out comes spring flow at Barton Springs, as well as some other springs that are associated with the flow system. So a natural resources definition for sustainability is that it's the avoidance of the depletion of natural resources to maintain an ecological balance. Now everybody and their third uncle has their own definition of sustainability. I'm also going to share with you the hydrogeologist's definition of sustainability that I tend to favor, which is the development and use of water in a manner that can be maintained for an indefinite time without causing unacceptable environmental, economic, or social consequences. I like that definition. Science has a lot of answers for how things work, how the natural system works. And science can inform people and policymakers, people who decide how much gets pumped or doesn't get pumped. But ultimately, it's people that make those decisions. And when I say people, there's certainly people in places of power, but it's also people like you, because it's the public involvement that helps to direct the decision makers and the policy makers. And the Save Our Springs Alliance has done some amazing things to protect Barton Springs and the Edwards Aquifer in this area, and that took citizens getting together to form a coalition to advocate for the springs and for the aquifer and for management. And any citizen, including each of you, can be involved in that. Now, this definition of sustainability, it has a strong people component to it, without causing unacceptable environmental, economic, and social consequences. Now, you may have a strong view of what unacceptable consequences are. For me personally, an unacceptable consequence would be Barton Springs drying up. That would be a very, very sad day for Austin, and for many of us. But there are people that may value the groundwater pumping more than the spring flow. And so people are all different. They have different opinions on what's an unacceptable environmental consequence, an unacceptable economic consequence, or an unacceptable social consequence. And again, that's why it's important for people and for each of you to be involved in getting your voices heard in these discussions on sustainability. Now, with respect to the Barton Springs, the sustainability is defined in maintaining spring flow during a repeat of the drought of record. And I believe it is still the drought of the 1950s for the aquifer in terms of what the drought of the record is. And there is a Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District that people formed that regulates that resource to achieve year-round spring flow at Barton Springs. If that was not there, then anybody could drill a well anywhere, pump as much as they wanted, and eventually that could affect the ability for Barton Springs to flow. And when we do get into droughts, the spring flows do go down and can struggle. There's also endangered species and other ecological aspects to those springs that come into play there as well. But there's a range of sustainable amount of pumping. So for example, how much flow do we want in Barton Springs? Is 50% before people came along during bad droughts good enough, or should it be 75% or 25%? Or maybe we're okay with letting it go dry for 3 months every once in a while. Those are all sustainable levels of pumping. And in fact, that case I talked about earlier, where the pumping is equal to the recharge, that would, let's just say, dries up the springs half the year. That would be a sustainable amount of pumping. So again, recognize that there's a spectrum of sustainability and decisions that have to be made, and people are involved all along in making those decisions. Now, some of y'all maybe are thinking, springs have never gone dry, which, as far as we know, Barton Springs has never gone dry. And it'll never happen. You know, the aquifer can take it. The springs will never go dry. I want to tell you two stories where similar springs did go dry. One is Comanche Springs out in Fort Stockton, where a tremendous amount of flow is coming out of Edwards rocks. The Edwards Formation extends all the way out through West Texas. If you've ever driven on I-10, say out to El Paso or back from El Paso and see those road cuts, you're looking at a lot of Edwards rocks that are similar to the same rocks that are feeding Barton Springs. And those springs had a nice natural swimming pool, just like we have at Barton Springs. Had a bunch of people actually relying on that flow for irrigating their farms. It was about 100 families. And a certain distance away, folks started drilling wells to irrigate their own farms, and the springs started to fail and then ultimately completely failed. And actually in pretty short order, just under a few years. And those springs completely went dry for 25 years, and these days they come back every once in a while during the winter months. And what the community had to do is build a pool, an Olympic-sized pool on stilts in the spring basin in order to still have the ability to swim out in that dry and dusty town. So that's a case where that's happened. And you might think, well, that's Fort Stockton, that's a long ways away, it's way out in West Texas. We've dried up springs in the Edwards Aquifer. Now there's a Barton Springs segment of the aquifer, and there's also a San Antonio segment. Where I work, we actually have San Marcos Springs, and it's literally outside my office window. If you've ever been down there to ride a glass bottom boat and see the springs, that's San Marcos Springs. There's also Kamal Springs in New Braunfels. If you go down to San Antonio, there's the San Antonio River, which was fed by the San Antonio Springs. And then there's also San Pedro Springs, which then fed into the San Antonio River. And there was a fellow by the name of Breckenridge who owned the property at the headwaters of the San Antonio Springs. And he built a beautiful house there because of the springs. And he was involved in supplying water to the growing city of San Antonio. And he noticed in the late 1800s that the spring flow was weakening because there'd been a drought. And so he had heard about some artesian wells being drilled in Texas, and so had a couple drilled there near the springs. And lo and behold, they came in as big gushers and helped provide water to San Antonio. But then he noticed that those wells, and once he drilled a couple of wells, and kind of everybody wanted their own well, and so more and more wells went in San Antonio, and he noticed the springs at San Antonio Springs starting to fail and becoming nothing more than a trickle. And somewhat brokenhearted because he had played a role in drying up these beloved springs that were literally in his front yard, he wound up selling part of his property and then giving a bunch of his property to San Antonio. And so these days, the San Antonio River is fed by treated wastewater that is brought back up to near the headwaters of San Antonio River and then flowed down the river. So it's kind of a sad story. Now, if aquifer levels are really high down there, you can actually still see those springs flowing, and it's a sight to behold, but they spend most of the time not flowing. So again, there's the distinct possibility of, without citizen involvement, without management, without diligence in protecting the sustainability of spring flow, there is a risk to the springs. So I'm going to kind of end my comments on boxes. And this ties in kind of sustainability of Barton Springs to the world. And I love cats. My wife and I have 6 cats. It's gotten out of control. 6 is the limit. There's no more. We're very tempted by a 7th one, but no. We've got Lily, Mies, Vincent, Theo, Olmec, and Jeff the ditch cat, because we wound up adopting him because he lived for many years in a ditch. But cats love boxes, right? You've seen the YouTube videos and the photos, and you set out a box. Tigers, even tigers like boxes. They get in the boxes. And so this next thing I'm going to talk about is about the box around sustainability. And I bring this up because several years ago there was a study done by one of the universities in Texas. I won't mention who it was, but it rhymes with M&M. And the study they released was looking at groundwater availability and sustainability of water resources for Texas. And I got invited to, and it was a class project. Universities will do that with kind of senior level classes sometime. And I got invited to speak to these students, and it was an economics class. And so we're talking about groundwater, and I'm talking about sustainability, and I could see the students kind of looking quizzically at each other. And so as I said, hey, something seems wrong. What am I saying that's causing you all concern? And it was that they had a very different definition of sustainability. And I walked away from that going, okay, that's interesting. Sustainability has a box around it. And so as hydrogeologists, when we talk about sustainability of an aquifer or a groundwater resource, our box is around that aquifer. For this study that was done, the box was Texas. And so they were looking at the sustainability of water supplies for Texas. And the conclusion they came to was, ultimately, we're all going to be drinking desalinated seawater. And there's a part of me that agrees with that. I'm not going to say all of us are, but I do think desalinated seawater is probably in our future. But it's expensive. And what they proposed was in the transition to that, it's okay to drain the state's aquifers. There's a bunch of water stored. Now, think back to that tub I talked to you about. There's a bunch of water in that tub, and you don't have to remove much water from that system for the springs to dry up. But there's some serious consequences from that. And so I think of the box around the aquifer. In this case, it's the Edwards Aquifer that serves Barton Springs. But there are other boxes out there. There is the box around Texas. Now, just because the box is around Texas and we're trying to meet our water supplies with a growing population, doesn't mean we can't do that without also, say, honoring spring flow or honoring ecosystems. There are options there that can be explored and can be implemented for us to get there. That box could also kind of step back to the United States as a whole in terms of how are we looking at sustainability across the country. And then, of course, there's the world itself, looking at sustainability in the world. There's also a box around time. Sometimes people look at sustainability as if we can meet our water needs for the next 50 years, we're good. You may be able to come up with a plan to meet your water needs for the next 50 years, but to me, sustainability means indefinitely. Can you do this forever? Can we manage the aquifer this way forever and still maintain spring flow and then maintain a certain amount of water for people coming out of the wells? So there's a box around time that you have to be aware of. There's also a box around climate. A lot of the decisions in Texas on sustainability or management is based on the past climate and is not factoring in climate change. Now, Austin has a water plan, Austin Water Forward, that is, their box includes Highland Lakes as well as the area aquifers, and they've built in climate change in there. But there's others that don't build in that climate change component. And the prediction is that we're probably going to be drier and certainly warmer in this part of Texas. And then finally, I'm going to end with a box around you. There's that coming back to that people component of what do the people want? Because people's desires and needs can change over time, or maybe just their attention. People can take things for granted. It's like a lot of the nice things we have in this world, in this area with Barton Springs is because folks have worked hard to get them and protect them. But if it gets taken for granted by people, the next generation, they could go away. because there's not concern about those natural resources, or maybe people aren't watching what's happening with those natural resources. And so, so think about that box and think about your place in that box and where you want to be in these future discussions on sustainability, not only of Barton Springs, but of water in Central Texas, water in Texas, the United States, and the world. And I will leave it at that. I understand that you all can ask questions on the computer machines, and those will get sent to me. Whoa, jeez. I'll add the theremin in as emphasis. Any questions?
I have one question. How did you discover the theremin and learn to play it? Why? How did you discover it?
So the question is how did I discover the theremin and learn to play it? And I like to tell people that Donna Summer changed my life. I grew up in rural Illinois, and I had a 1-hour bus ride to school and 1-hour bus ride back home. And thankfully there was a radio on the bus, and the bus driver would be playing the station that played the hits. And I vividly remember this. And the bus was going by Fenton, Illinois, and on came "I Feel Love" by Donna Summer. And if you don't know that song, you need to go check it out. Some people think it's which I agree with. It's probably the first techno song. You know, it's got a lot of electronic and synthesizers and the syncopated beat, and I was in love. I mean, I was just like, wow, what is that? So that got me interested in electronic music, and went to college and had some synth bands when I was in college. Moved to Austin in '91 and had some synthesizer-based bands, and I've always been kind of interested in electronic instruments. And so this documentary that came out about Leon Theremin, which I highly recommend because it's a fascinating story. He was a Russian scientist. He kind of got crosswise with the Russians and Stalin at some point, got kidnapped, and it's all kinds of crazy stuff. But I walked out of there blown away, and I was thinking, I need a theremin. And so I got a kit and put one together. It only half worked because I'm not very good at electronics. And then Bob Moog then had this kit, and so I got it where the circuit board was mostly put together, and I've been kind of playing it since. Curiously, this instrument works really well with country music. I've sat in with a number of country bands, one punk band, but because it kind of sounds like the saw. Have you ever seen somebody play the saw? You know, and the saw kind of sounds like this. I've kind of riffed back and forth on slide guitar, which is really cool. And then more recently, although we've been kind of scuttled with the pandemic, two friends and I have formed a band called Uma Theremin, and so it's it's 3 theremins with some electronics. So yeah, I've always kind of loved it, and love showing people it. And it's such an interesting instrument. When my wife and I got married, we had a thereminist who actually knows how to play it, come and play the wedding march. It was just beautiful.
Well, everybody's very interested in this on Facebook.
Cool.
So next question, and I know Bill has one too. What should local communities be doing now to curtail water usage to ensure that groundwater is available for the future?
So the question is what should local communities do to ensure that there's water available for the future? I love that question because it's scalable. And by that I mean there's things that you and I can do as individuals, all the way up to entire communities as well as the state. And as an individual, there's the whole, turn the water off when you're brushing your teeth, but, ensuring you have efficient water fixtures. My wife and I use rainwater harvesting to water our gardens and parts of our yard, combined with xeriscaping, so we don't use any water outside. So like a typical Texan residence, it's about 100 gallons per person per day, and we're below 30 gallons per person per day. So that's a 70% savings there. So just thinking about how to do water, and then also, we haven't radically changed had to radically change our life to do that. Austin is doing a very good job with the Austin Water Forward Plan. Austin supports rainwater harvesting. There's ways that you can get more efficient water fixtures. But then the reuse. Mentioned about San Antonio taking treated wastewater and putting it back into the river. More and more companies are looking to reuse treated wastewater. Austin is building a new permit center that actually has an on-site wastewater treatment plant. Well, then they'll recycle that water back into the building to flush toilets, rather than using water from the Colorado River, the Highland Lakes. So just many things that each of us can do, and then also that we can support our communities doing to use less of the source water.
We have several questions.
How about a similar question about protecting quality?
So a similar question is on protecting water quality, and that's real important. And something that needs to be considered. Now, on a personal level, my wife and I, as a model, we don't use any pesticides or herbicides outside to protect not only groundwater quality, because that stuff can leach then down into, or nitrogen or anything like that, leach into the groundwater system or run off of our property. Excuse me. Everybody ducked, in case you're wondering. But then, wastewater can have some issues as well, and particularly in pristine hill country environments. And so, greater treatment of wastewater to clean it up more, so that which does recharge the aquifer or make into the river has less environmental impact. And then we're starting to see more and more something called direct potable reuse, where the water is completely cleaned up through reverse osmosis, and then the wastewater, and then it's put back into the drinking water system. And so, that arguably is probably the best way of keeping microcontaminants in wastewater from getting into the natural system.
Next one.
I'll go as long as you want me to.
Okay, this real good one. I think one of the conservation district candidates is a desalinization project proponent. Could you speak more about this option?
So, question is I guess one of the candidates for the groundwater district is a desalination proponent. And not sure what that means. That could mean a couple of different things. A lot of times when we think about desalination, the mind immediately goes to the ocean desalination, but you can also desalinate groundwater, and almost all of our aquifers in the state, including the Edwards Aquifer here in Austin, has a bad water line, in which case there's poor quality water on the other side of that. And so that water could be produced, desalinated, and then put into, say, the drinking water distribution system. Of course, you have to be careful there that you're not robbing Peter to pay Pauline, that you're not pulling salty groundwater out of the Edwards that has an impact or pulls fresh water deeper. But because of the Balcones fault zone and all the faults through here, the thought is that we can find compartments that you can pull that water out. If that candidate's proposing seawater desalination, it's certainly a possibility. San Antonio has that in their water plan. Austin does not at this point, in large part because of the Colorado River. That water is very expensive. You have to build a pipeline. It's a lot of energy, and so there's some kind of climate feedback potential issues there, depending where your energy comes from. And there's also environmental concerns, because when you desalinate, you create a far saltier kind of reject water that has to be disposed of. And typically with coastal seawater desalination systems, that would be put back out into the Gulf of Mexico.
From Cindy Hobson, what are key indicators of aquifer health / capacity that we can look to?
Question is what are key indicators of aquifer health and capacity that we can look to? One, my opinion, the best is spring flow. And so Barton Springs is really the heartbeat of the Edwards Aquifer in this area. And when those springs go down, it's telling you something. And when they come up, it's telling you something. So first and foremost, spring flow measurements, but then also the wells themselves. So I mentioned earlier that people will drill these holes to access the water. But you can also drill a hole and use it to measure where the water level is. And so, in the, this will be fun, in the aquifer, if the water levels are high, you'll see greater spring flow, and if they're low, you'll see less spring flow. And so you can use, it's kind of like a dipstick of checking the oil in your car or something. You can use those water levels to tell you something about what's happening with the aquifer. And then the spring measurements of spring flow and water levels in the aquifer can also tell you kind of how recharge and pumping is interacting with the aquifer.
Okay, here's another question. Should wastewater plants place any priority on returning base flows versus maximizing reuse?
So should communities place any priority on reusing wastewater, treated wastewater, or returning flows to the river? That's an excellent question, and there is a balancing act there. The way kind of most of surface water at least works is that once a city or somebody has a right to the water from the river, they're not required to put it back in. Now there's some exceptions to that, but mostly that's accurate. And that can be a problem because there's environmental flow needs downstream from a community in the river. And so there's some concern that if communities reuse their wastewater more and more and take it to the limit, which is reusing everything, then you won't have water going back into the river for the environment. And so my response would be yes, both of those need to be considered. And Austin actually does a good job of considering that. And so they're committed, and Austin is committed in its water plan to ensure that there's some of that wastewater is put back into the river for environmental flow needs. And there's also people downstream that may rely on that water as well.
Okay.
One more?
Yeah,
We got one more.
Okay, what's the most threatened spring in the Edwards Aquifer?
Question is what's the most threatened spring in the Edwards Aquifer? Good grief, what a good question. Not one I've thought about before. This is arguable. I'm going to give two answers. One from a water quantity standpoint, which I'm going to say is possibly San Felipe Spring down in Del Rio, in Valverde County. And that's beautiful Edwards Spring that supplies water to the city of Del Rio. In fact, they have pipes that go kind of right into where the spring flows out. But there's no groundwater district there, and there seems to be this ever-present threat of groundwater marketing where people are seeking to sell the groundwater to someone else. And so I think that spring is threatened. And then I'm going to talk about water quality aspect, and quite frankly, Barton Springs is probably, when you look at water quality, Barton Springs is probably the most threatened as the growth in this area, extends out across the recharge zone and the contributing zone, and there's more wastewater that is impacting nutrients, E. coli, and microcontaminants, like hormones and things like that get in the water. So, well, thank you so much. I loved being here this morning and showing you the theremin. And I will turn it back over. Are you going to say something?
Yeah, I'm
All
just
right.
gonna say really quickly. Yay, Dr. Knight, that was great. Okay, we're going to take a short break, about 2 minutes, and you'll get to see some beautiful underwater footage from 1995 during this 2-minute break, and then we'll be back with live streaming our other videos. So stay tuned and stay with us. Thank you.